Our next topic is the origin of what we call biological evil. And we're going to have to define these terms, what biological evil is. Evil in general is actually classified into several categories. We have something called moral evil that would correspond to sin itself. So if a person disobeyed a commandment of God, that's a moral disobedience, that's a moral evil. In contrast, we have something called natural evil. This is what theologians and philosophers have assigned to those things in the natural world that in fact result in the suffering of humans or animals. So this would be things like, let's say, a tornado comes through an area and causes suffering of humans and animals, a flood, an avalanche, a volcano, disease. Anything that would cause human and or animal suffering is something we'd call natural evil. We can subdivide natural evil into different kinds of natural evil. And one of those, as I mentioned, let's say things like hurricanes and tornadoes, those aren't biological natural evils. Those might be geological or climatological natural evils. Biological natural evil would be things in the biological world that cause human and or animal suffering. So, for example, in this category, degenerative aging is a biological evil. And we're not talking about aging where you grow up from a baby into a mature individual. We're talking about once that has occurred and you've become a mature individual, in years that come you become more feeble. Pain increases. You can't stand up as straight, can't hear as well, can't see as well. It's degenerative aging. Rather than the person being mature, the person is old. They've gone over the hill. This would be the kind of thing referred to as degenerative aging. This is something that causes suffering in both humans and, in fact, animals. They can go through degenerative aging where they aren't as, they feel more pain, they feel unnecessary pain because of their age. Other examples of biological evil would be disease, where organisms suffer because of the disease that they have been subject to. In this category would be parasites that cause harm on another individual, cause suffering on another individual. Death is something that would cause suffering, both in the process of dying might involve suffering, and when someone has lost someone they've been in association with their whole life or for many years, there is a suffering involved in the loss of that individual. Other examples would be predation, where animals are eating other animals. I suppose if that's done fast enough, there's not necessarily any suffering, but sometimes it's the process of killing another organism, that organism suffers. There's also another process we'll talk about called natural selection that also involves evil. These are examples of biological evil. According to what we've already said, according to the young age creationist position, all natural evil is due to man's fall. It's all a consequence of the curse that came about in Genesis chapter 3. That would make all evil due to sin, specifically human sin. Moral evil obviously is due to sin because it is sin. That's what it's described as. But in addition to that, the consequence of human sin is the curse that God placed upon the creation. That would place all natural evil also within the list of things that are due to the consequence. They're a consequence of man's sin. So the original creation before the fall was in fact without death, without aging, without disease, parasitism, predation, natural selection. There was no biological evil, there was no climatological evil, there was no geological evil, there was no moral evil. The entire creation was without any evil at all. So then it would make sense that God could look at everything He had created and made and say, it is very good. It is without evil. of any sort whatsoever. But at the fall, as I said, the curse comes. God introduces natural evil into the creation. And I'm going to argue that there are at least two different major types of natural evil, in this case biological evil, that's introduced at the fall. And I'm going to call one of them negative effects of the fall. That's what I'm about to go through. And the other, the evil minimizing effects of the fall, we'll come to after this. First of all, the negative effects of the fall. Here, kind of trying to conceive of what it was that changed from the pre-fall world to the post-fall world. What changed with the curse? If, in fact, death is introduced after the fall, then before the fall, humans never died, would have never died. Animals would have never died. If the fall had never occurred, they would never have done so. How is it that humans could exist forever and ever? How is it that animals could exist forever and ever? If for this to occur, it would seem that there must have been something designed in humans, in animals, that allowed them to repair any damage that might have happened. If you accidentally hurt yourself, cut yourself, something like that. There's got to be repair mechanisms that God created in humans and animals to completely and perfectly repair whatever damage was done. This would mean biological repair systems or designs were in place before the fall that were perfect. They never made a mistake. They perfectly repaired every mistake. And perhaps at the curse, God introduced slight imperfections in that repair process, so that now slight imperfections were introduced into the world or were allowed into the world. Organisms weren't fully repaired when they were injured, and this could explain such things as degenerative aging. When we grow up from a child into an adult, but we persist for years and years thereafter, if our repair mechanisms are just slightly off, then we're going to accumulate more and more little mistakes or little injuries that cumulatively over time add up to make us more and more feeble, to increase our pain more and more, compromise our systems, make us less capable of doing what we were once doing with time. And so that would explain the slight imperfections introduced into the biological repair mechanisms would explain such things as degenerative aging. It would also perhaps explain a lot of what we now understand disease to be. For example, we've got genetic information in our bodies that tells our bodies how to build things properly. If small mistakes were inserted into those instructions on what is on how to build things in the body, things called mutations. We'll talk about these later. We'll learn a little bit more about them later. Then gradually we would get to a point where our bodies don't work as well, where we have genetic diseases. So genetic diseases might be the result of slight imperfections. Also, organisms that are supposed to be living with us in mutualistic relationship with us. Let's say there was some small changes that occurred in them, that those organisms started to eat slightly different things than they did before because of these mistakes. They maybe ate the right things but at the wrong times. Now perhaps these organisms that were once in a nice mutualistic relationship with us began, in fact, to extract more from us than we gave to them. So what was once a nice relationship where each benefited the same amount, gradually one organism would benefit at the expense of the other would actually be harmed. When you've got a situation of a long-term relationship between two organisms where one organism is in fact benefiting but the other is being harmed in the relationship, we call that parasitism. So we now have three major types of symbiosis that we've looked at in the course so far. We've got mutualism, where both benefit equally. We've got commensalism, where one benefits, the other doesn't seem to be affected positively or negatively. And now we have parasitism, where one organism benefits, the other is harmed in that relationship. It's very likely that parasitism comes following the fall as a result of slight imperfections in the parasite that is hurting another organism. In general, we might expect that pathogenesis in general comes as a result of the curse. What is pathogenesis? It's derived from two Greek words, pathos, which means suffering or refers to suffering, and genesis, which refers to the origin of. Pathogenesis is the origin of suffering. Pathogenesis is actually the process whereby a disease comes to be. How is it that a person begins to suffer because of a disease? That's pathogenesis. And pathogenesis, the origin of disease, probably dates from after the fall because of these slight imperfections in repair mechanisms. So pathogens, these are organisms that cause disease. Pathogens were probably organisms before the fall that were in nice mutualistic relationship with other organisms, but after the fall began by slight imperfections in their repair mechanisms, they began to eat too much, or they began to harm the organism they were with, and causing, therefore, disease in those organisms. So we suspect that it's at the fall that pathogenesis occurs, that pathogens enter the system, that parasites begin, that disease itself arose after the fall because of basically broken relationships that were once before the fall very positive, constructive relationships. Also, we've already the arise of not just organisms that cause disease by being inside another organism normally causing disease, but the parasites that I referred to. Parasite, by the way, is the animal that's benefiting but doing the harm on another organism. The host is the organism that is being parasitized by the parasite. So we think that degenerative aging, disease, and parasitism are negative effects of the fall that come probably as a result of slight imperfections in the repair mechanism. But those weren't all the changes that occurred at the fall. That's not all the biological evil that's introduced at the fall. There's another category of changes, which I call the evil minimizing effects of the fall. When God introduced the curse, there's a possibility that this curse, this broken, what was once perfection in the world is now broken, that break might shatter the world and destroy any of the pictures that God wanted to show of himself. He doesn't want that to happen. So he wants the creation to be cursed because of man's sin, but not cursed so much that it's going to not be able to function. Not cursed so much that it won't still show the very nature of God. So he, I believe, introduced with the curse things that keep evil, natural evil, biological evil, from spreading so much or destroying so much that the biological world would be compromised. And one example of this is where God said, following the curse, "Lest man take of the tree of life and live forever," God sends Adam out of the garden. So here's the situation. God said, God had already cursed the creation. He had cursed the ground. He'd cursed humans. He'd cursed the animals and the plants. But Adam was still in the garden. He still had access to the tree of life. Apparently, if he had, even at that point, if he had lived in the garden and had access to the tree of life, he would have lived forever. Somehow, eating the tree of life allowed him to live forever. But this would create a real problem, because if, in fact, he is now, for the rest of his life, going to gradually deteriorate, every day he's going to be feeling a little bit more pain than he did the day before because of degenerative aging. If every day he's not as able to see as well as he did the day before and hear as well as he did the day before, as he degenerates through time, he's going to increase his own suffering through time. But if he eats the tree of life and lives forever, he's forever going to become more and more degenerated. He's going to feel pain more and more forever. His suffering is going to increase, and he can't die. He can't end this process. That would be horrible. So God says, lest he take of the tree of life and live forever, because this wouldn't be a good thing in a fallen world, he then kicks Adam out of the garden so that Adam could die. What this means is death is merciful. Now, death is not a good thing in the world before the fall. Before the fall, the world is perfect and good, and it's good that things live forever. But once the curse is introduced, death becomes merciful. Something that's that's suffering, that's in great unnecessary pain because of disease or because of degenerative aging or because of a parasite. These things, death comes as a relief from this suffering. Death comes as a good thing. Now don't get me wrong, death in an absolute sense is not good. Death isn't good before the fall, but in a fallen world, death becomes a good thing. Death is an evil minimizing thing. After the fall, it functions to limit the amount of evil or suffering that's in the world. And so in general, God introduced death to minimize the suffering of animals and humans. Again, it's not good before the fall, and none of these things that I'm about to mention are good before the fall, but after the fall, they become good things to limit the evil of the fallen world. But as soon as he's introduced the concept of death, if he doesn't change some other things, organisms are going to go out of existence. Because if in the pre-fall world, organisms never died, if animals never died, then when they had their offspring, none of those offspring would ever die. They were commanded to fill the earth. They probably didn't produce a lot of offspring because everyone's going to survive. And there's probably going to be a day when they fill the earth when they will stop reproducing. The reproductive rate in organisms before the fall was probably very, very low. Because it really doesn't matter how long it takes to fill the earth either. So if that had remained the case after the fall, then for every animal that died, they wouldn't be producing enough young to replace the ones that died. And then if a disease came into a population, it could wipe things out faster than those organisms were able to replace those who were dying due to the disease. So in order for species to continue after the fall, after the fall, for organisms to survive, God's going to have to step up the reproductive rate. Organisms are going to have to be producing young much faster than they did before the fall to make sure that they can survive this event called the curse. And this introduces something we call overproduction. Organisms produce more offspring, more young, than can survive to produce offspring of their own, because some of them die before they can produce offspring. So you have to produce, if you want 90 offspring to survive, but you know that 30 of them are going to die before they get to that stage, then you're going to have to produce 120 offspring in order for 90 of them to survive, to have young, which means you've got to produce more, 120, than are going to survive. You're going to have 100. This is called overproduction, where you're producing more organisms than will survive. There's another consequence, though, to overproduction. That's a good thing for keeping the species alive, but here's another problem. Now you've got 120 organisms competing with one another to eat the resources of 90 organisms. In other words, there's something we call natural selection that comes in at this point. When you are overproducing, you're producing more offspring than will survive, then they're going to be competing for limited resources. And under those circumstances, when they're competing with one another, the ones that are strongest are going to make it. The ones that are weakest, that can't get to the food as effectively as others, will in fact die. So natural selection takes out the organisms that are weaker and preserves the ones that are stronger. Now, this doesn't sound like a very good thing, and again, it isn't a very good thing before the fall, but after the fall, Natural selection tends to take out the diseased organisms as opposed to those that aren't diseased. It takes out those that are suffering more than those who are suffering less. Because the ones who are suffering more usually can't get to the food or can't get to the food faster than the others. So natural selection tends to take out the suffering in the world, tends to take out those who are suffering the most, which means natural selection tends to minimize the amount of suffering in the world the same kind of way that death does. And so we also introduce at this time, God introduced at this time, predation, carnivory, where animals are eating other animals. Now again, this is not a good thing in a pre-fall world, before the fall, but after the fall, if animals eat other animals, then the ones that are being eaten are going to have to try to run away from the ones that are eating them. The predators will tend to catch and eat the slower ones among the prey. The slower ones are typically those that are sicker, those that are undergoing the most suffering. So just like natural selection tends to take out the ones that are suffering the most, predation and carnivory take out the animals that are suffering the most. This again minimizes the evil, the disease, and so on that we find in the world. At the same time, God introduced yet another thing. Because if you've got animals now eating other animals, then what about the poor animals that are being eaten? God introduced into those animals what we call defenses, biological defenses. God introduces abilities in the animals that are being pursued to be eaten, the ability to run fast, the ability to fight back, the ability to hide, to camouflage. None of these things would be necessary before the fall. You don't have to hide if you're not dying and you're not afraid of dying. You don't have to fight back if nothing is attacking you, that you're in mutualistic relationship with everything else. This is only necessary in that fallen world with predation. All of these things, death, overproduction, natural selection, predation, and defenses, are introduced at the curse as means of limiting the amount of evil, natural evil, biological evil, that existed before the fall. None of them are good in the pre-fall world, but all of them turn out to be good, or at least minimizing evil, in the post-fall world. So in general, and it's important that you remember this is going to be a point that's going to be important in the future here, the curse that God placed upon His creation because of man's fall involve both degenerative effects that really are negative effects of the fall, as well as other effects or changes that were evil minimizing. Those effects, the second set of effects, the evil minimizing effects, are not good before the fall, but they're good after the fall of man.